Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GeekNarrator podcast. I am your host, Kaivalya Apte, and I am back with another very interesting topic. Non-functional requirements is something that we software developers and architects deal with almost every day while we are building software applications, maintaining them, designing them. And it's such an interesting and important topic that it is also covered in a lot of system design interviews to come up with non-functional requirements. So we are going to dive deep into non-functional requirements, understand more about them, how to approach non-functional requirements, how to document them. And to do that, I have a very special guest with me, Mr. Paul Christmann, who is currently working as a Chief Innovation Officer at Rasa.io. And so welcome, Paul. I'm really excited to have you and looking forward to get all the details from your experience about non-functional requirements. So welcome, and let's start with a little bit of introduction.
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to chat with you, chat with your audience about my experience with it. I've been in the software space for nearly 30 years now. I started building desktop applications around airline scheduling software, which was C and Fortran and desktop and very, very data, very, very processing heavy. And over the time since then, I've moved through other desktop applications, a lot of business focused applications, moved into web application developments, a little B2C, through travel industry problems, oil and gas industry problems. And as you mentioned today, I work for Rasa. Rasa.io, we produce personalized newsletters using artificial intelligence. Again, it's a SaaS application with backing AI engines, back-end data processing, and front-end web and usability requirements.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's start with a brief introduction about the topic and the agenda. So we say non-functional requirements, and of course it is often compared with functional requirements. So just to set the basic context here, just to make our audience understand that what is the difference. So how would you define non-functional requirements? What is it and what is it not?
Well, it's interesting. Functional requirements are the easy ones. That's how I think of it. These are the easy ones. Anytime you're talking to a user, whether that user is yourself with a different hat on, or you're talking to your users and your business representatives, everybody speaks functional requirements. I want it to do this. The functional requirement is the what.
Yeah.
The non-functional requirement is the how. What are the side constraints that are going to govern how you meet the what's? And again, there's many different ways of looking at it, but often I think, the non-functional requirements, they're harder to articulate, harder to think about, especially from the user side, from the client side, from the customer side. It's easy to think about the functional, what must it do, but it's harder to get into really defining a non-functional, how does it need to work? But that's what I always view as the difference, the how versus the what.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just to take some example, for example, I have a chat application, right? So how would you define or how would you explain functional requirements for a chat application versus non-functional requirement?
Well, so the chat application, functional requirements really get to what are you chatting about? Again, we're in the AI space. That's the world I'm currently living in. So the functional requirements are going to describe what kind of conversation does my chatbot need to have? Oh, this is a customer support chatbot. I have to build training models that start talking about the vocabulary, the questions, the answers that this chatbot will respond to. That's the heart of the functional requirements in a chatbot.
Yeah.
The non-functional requirements get to all of the work that surrounds that. Again, it's one thing to talk about AI modeling for a chatbot to answer a question. Oh, to do that, I have quite possibly very large data sets behind the scenes. How am I going to store this data? This data may become quite necessary for retraining and growing models. So what's my redundancy plans on it? What are my recovery plans on it? AI modeling can take a long time for training data sets. Oh, what's the response time for training data sets? What's the response time for a user when they ask a question? How long do I have before they get to an answer? So the non-functional, for every functional question, there's almost a limitless set of non-functional requirements that go into describing that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think functional requirements, as you said, it's the what part, and non-functional are how part. And so the what part is, the basic, like what are you providing to the user? But then the how part actually defines how the user would experience it, or how it would feel for the user to use the product, right? So, so I was listening to a podcast, and they gave like an example of a restaurant where, the functional requirements or something like that can be defined as what you're serving as food. But then the non-functional requirements are everything around it, like how are you serving, how fast are you serving food, and what is the quality of the food and all that. So does it make sense, or what will you add, or what will you change in this?
No, again, that mirrors very much the way I would think of it. I've not thought of it from that picture, but again, I would go back and say, if I'm going to build a restaurant, I start with the equivalent of user stories. User stories, I think most software engineers under some nomenclature are familiar with a user story. The diner wants to eat. And so that becomes the user story. And now we've described the functional requirement and what are the steps. We all can start talking through flow charts and breakdowns of how does the user achieve their goal. Yeah. Great. Now you have to come along aside from that and start talking about, well, again, what governs how the user eats their food? As you say, how quickly do they expect it? I have very different expectations for how quickly to provide food. Am I going to a 5-star Michelin rated dining establishment? I expect my food will take longer. As a user experience, I will expect and be happy waiting longer. If I go to fast food restaurant down the street, I better not wait as long. My expectations are the food will be there faster. Yeah. Either one, it's the same user story, the same functional requirement. Okay, there's actually a lot of different functional between those two experiences, but conceptually, it's the same functional story. The non-functional really describes how the experience is different for the user. Yeah, makes sense. And I think since it is not like a defined set of requirements, it sometimes gets difficult to capture all the requirements, all the non-functional requirements around the product that you're trying to build. And that's why it is more important than the functional requirements is what I believe. Before we dive deep into how to approach non-functional requirements, I wanted to understand if you could share your experience with non-functional requirements and how it has been overall. So again, I've worked with software companies for 30 years in many different facets, both large companies, small startups. Yeah. First thing I'll say is the difference in my experience difference with non-functional requirements reflects a large difference in product and company maturity. So for example, around 2010, I was working for a travel-related software company. We were working with very large financial companies providing travel booking experiences for them. Yeah. They had, through years of expertise and through client expectations, very rigorous expectations for reliability, uptime, and response time for applications. For a company like that, our non-functional requirement discovery had to be and was very thorough, both in coverage of the sets of requirements and the depth of documentation of those requirements. It's much more precise about what response times are expected for clients like that and the product maturity. A lot of other times I work with startup companies. For example, I'm working with one right now where I literally said, for my performance, if I may show my sheet of paper, my measurement of performance as a non-functional requirement is fast enough. That is sufficient at this stage. We can talk a little more, about why I've got that, what it means in this case. But again, it really boils down to understanding the product and the customer you're working with to figure out the right breadth and depth of definition of these requirements.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. So talking about, how should we approach non-functional requirements? What should we do? So for example, if we are building a web application, and I am responsible for, gathering of course, the functional requirements, but I've done that. The product managers are happy. And now I have to take care of the non-functional requirements as well. So first of all, I wanted to understand, in your experience, what you have seen works quite well when it comes to responsibility. Like, who is responsible for defining and, finding the non-functional requirements? And is it the developer? Is it the product manager? Is it analysts? Or, who else is required to, define like a good set of non-functional requirements? And then the next part of the question is, how should we approach it? Like, is there like some steps that we should follow to get like a good set of non-functional requirements?
Let me answer those in reverse order, because the answer to one may lead to the discovery and discussion of the other.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the how to do this part, I don't find there to be good, rigorous guidelines for this. In the end, it boils down to two items that I can point to. Number one is what I just call interviews. You have to talk to all of the business all the business owners. There's just no replacement for this. Different business owners have different perspectives on what's important for them. These perspectives are going to be contradictory. They are going to be incompatible. But there's really no other replacement for that. Now, you can say the same about functional requirements. Maybe the only definition is interviewing and such. But for non-functional in particular, I've never found any other way of doing this effectively short of the conversations which are driven by, point number two, experience. And experience doesn't necessarily equate to years of experience in the industry, but it equates to experience around building software. That experience can come from research, reading, podcasts. In the end, while the number of non-functional requirements you may pursue feels infinite, there's a pretty small categorization of these that can guide your research, your interviews, your experience. In the end, we're going to be talking about reliability under some measurement. And there's lots of facets of reliability. We're going to be talking about security. We're going to be talking about maintainability. We're going to be talking about usability. There become a fairly small set of categories that as a software developer, you begin to build your experience, build your knowledge of what's important, and you begin to use those to ask the sometimes pointed questions of the business owners about what's important. Those questions themselves, we'll get to the responsibility part soon enough. The questions that are asked of business people, these are tricky. These are tricky questions because you ask somebody in the business side, what's my reliability? Their answer is like, wait, why is that even a question? I want the system to be up 100% of the time. That's the easy business answer. On the technology response, well, sure, I can build that. The cost of building that grows very quickly. Wait, you mean I have to have 100% uptime if Amazon goes down? Oh, I need a full cross-cloud redundant system? It's going to cost a lot. Let's back off. So the cost trade-off, trying to phrase cost trade-offs for the clients to really hone in on what is important measurements for this. That again is, questions. It's the difference perhaps around some of the functional requirements versus non-functional requirements is getting a user on board with an answer they're just not going to be comfortable with. It's like, yeah, you know what? I've gone through this every time. You will not have 100% uptime. You will not have 5 nines. You will not have 4 nines. Let's talk about what's important for this industry. Is this problem? What is important? What can your clients actually live with, and use that to guide how you try and find the requirements? So again, it's it is experience, research driven, or actually gained in the field that gives you a sense of the different types of non-functional requirements. And then it's the conversations with the business owners and the product managers to say, really, how important are these things?
Yeah,
that's a lot of the how. Whose job is it, as you ask? I'm technology focused. That's my experience. That's my background. I will answer this as this should be technology driven. Now, if you've got great product managers with technology knowledge, fantastic. They can provide that. But I'd encourage all the engineers, all developers, build the skill set to be able to do this, because the technology side has to drive the trade-off conversations. I have to be able to articulate to the process owner, why is it expensive to build a cross-cloud redundant system? That's a technology problem. Unfortunately, the business owners often see, well, bank systems are up 100% of the time. Why can't you? I'm like, well, okay, because they've spent a lot of time and energy to meet this. I have to be able to articulate. And it takes the technology knowledge, often very deep technology knowledge, to be able to articulate the reasons for those kinds of trade-off.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I also believe that it should be, technology driven, because, at the end, what we are trying to build is a technology, and, the cost and the effort estimation is going to be driven by the technology choices that we make. And not everything would be possible as expected from the, business people or from the customers. So there needs to be some push that is given by the technology people to, figure out like a good balance between what we can support and what we cannot. Yes, I think it makes sense. Coming to the cost part of it, I find sometimes it's very difficult to, coming up with some numbers around, cost until we have built something, right? So how does that work? So if I'm approaching to something very new, how do I get those numbers around the cost? And cost is not just, directly related to the amount of, money that we are paying to a cloud provider. It can also be the number of resources in terms of developers we would need and all that. So how do we do like a rough yet good enough calculation to give the business people a good number to justify our use case and, the reasoning why certain things are possible and certain things are not?
When you find the answer to that, please let me know. It's unfortunately addressing non-functional requirements is quite possibly the hardest part of estimation.
Yeah.
It is easy for me to look at facets of non-functional requirements and tell you what parts are going to be hard. It's very hard for me to predict the actual complexity of solving those hard problems, let alone the costs of doing so. Again, if I've built cross-cloud reliable systems before, well, then great. In my arsenal of experience, I have the framework for that answer. So there's always a question for if providing estimates for things you've done before, that becomes easier. Let's leave that aside and say, oh, I'm staring at non-functional requirements that are in new space. I really don't know it. I know I have to achieve 3-second response time on a page. Yeah. How am I going to get there? I don't know early stage because I don't yet know where my challenges will reside. let alone how I will address those challenges. I merely know right now that it will be hard the more, by whatever measure I use, the more I need, the harder it will be. And that curve is not linear. It is not a linear curve. Again, thinking of response time. 10-second response time, that's easy to get. 5 seconds might still be easy to get. There's a point where suddenly every increment that I want to save begins to cost more and more and more and more. Very nonlinear.
Yes. Yeah.
But where are those data points? Where are the breaks in this line? What does the curve represent? That is exceedingly hard to know early on in a process, which guides a lot of my conversations and thoughts about early stage non-functional requirements. I can, for example, I was mentioned before, I'm working with a company right now that's building a GIS system for valuing lands. I talked about response time and performance. We know there is a particular gesture that we think is a value prop for the business. Okay, that's the gesture. The user says, oh, when I do this kind of action on the map, I want to see these kinds of results. Functional requirement. That's the heart of the business. From the non-functional side, the answer is the performance has to be acceptable. I don't even know enough to assert the user expectations. This is not a banking transaction system where I can say, oh, the user may expect that the account comes back to them and reflects their deposit in half a second. There's a user expectation that I have to meet. I don't know what that is. But so that's why from a performance, from the non-functional requirement, when I call it out as it has to be fast enough, what I'm attempting to achieve in this stage is get everybody, business owners and technologies, focused on this as a problem that we have to be aware of. That's the earliest stage you can think about in NFRs, is at least quantify this. Let me figure out, what do I have to look at? Let me start engineering things so that I can be watchful of this, but I don't have a clue what the actual measurements are, let alone, back to the question you originally asked, I couldn't tell you how much it will cost me to get to 1 second response time. I understand the business is going to want that answer. But from a technology side, rather than giving you a bad or fake answer, which is all I can do right now, I've just got to say, I cannot give you that answer. I can merely say, here's how we're architecting to be aware of this problem and set ourselves up to be able to measure and address as we discover.
I think that's
a long way of finally saying, no, I don't know how to answer the question you asked that we all want to ask and we all want answers to.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really difficult one. And of course, I don't think we can ever get like a good or even close enough to the reality estimation because things change over time, things go wrong. So a lot of it can change depending on that. Talking about, the future part of gathering requirements, right? So if I'm building an application, how futuristic should I be? Should I talk about 5 years down the line? Should I only talk about 1 year down the line? What in your experience works best? Because what I have seen is it becomes more and more iterative. You just release the first version and then, iterate over it and try to improve things and, go one step at a time. But sometimes it helps to have some futuristic knowledge, right? So what is your experience with that?
I think it's important for the product, again, to understand the requirements that are the business value. Again, I'll come back to this one and say, we know that for the business that we're going to be in, I need the users to be able to do this, see that. That is part of the business value. Okay, let's architect now with the idea that I'm cognizant of this problem. What does that mean from an architecture? It means I'd better not have a bottleneck in my processing of this data. So I've got to design right off the bat for scalability here, for partitioning of data. I have to design for that. Now, when I implement early stage, I may implement a scalability with a limit of 1 because that's easy and it doesn't solve it. But I've implemented already with the knowledge that these pieces may scale. The data partitioning, maybe a partition of 1, because today that solves what I need. So the key is to understand the non-functional requirements that really represent the business value prop and start designing your code, your solution today with pieces in play that allow you to solve a problem later and then choose not to solve that problem today. In many regards, I would say software engineering is all about choosing what I don't want to do today, do as little as I can today so I know I can solve the problem later. So for me, looking at, 5 years down the road, 3 years down the road, like I can't even fathom what technologies will be available that change my problem statement. A year from now it seems preposterous to be planning for things a year from now. Things move so quickly. It's like, no, a couple months at a time for me. It's like, all right, we're, early on, let me just identify where points of trouble will be and do my best to abstract those points of complexity so that later I will be able to put in new implementations to address the actual complexities, the actual challenges that I see later. That's sort of my take on, especially focused on performance ones. Counterpoint to that, we had a long conversation about usability on the front end, browser compatibility. Again, this is a GIS application. We have a lot of data to be displayed. How do I build a solution now that degrades gracefully across browser experiences? That's one that I feel there's a bigger discontinuity in my implementation approach today. Building a graceful, responsive, complex application is quite challenging. It's a heck of a lot easier to not deal with that problem at all. But if by doing that, it also becomes much harder, in my experience, in the application to abstract away layout decisions. So we're faced with the decision today that we have not yet made, which is, are we going to just lock in and say, these are the browsers and resolutions we support, we will build for that, knowing that in 6 months, a year, when we actually want to expand the platform, we're going to be rebuilding. So everything sort of comes with the trade-offs and the losses, but even knowing that things have trade-offs, things have costs. Okay, now I can start to conceptualize those costs and make my decisions in light of those. But by default, my perspective is always focus short term. Longer term, I have less knowledge of what my product will need. The number of times I've been wrong about how my customers will use a platform, lots. So let me not solve the problems that may prove not to be problems once I start getting adoption. Solve the problems I know I need and defer the ones I don't know about. And a lot of the NFRs and frankly functional requirements as well fall into that category as well. About just don't know. I think I need them. Maybe I don't.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so I think that's why what I've seen, even for functional requirements, we have like an MVP, which is the first version that of features that we want to release. Have you seen like a MVP for non-functional requirements in your experience? Like, okay, these are the non-functional requirements that we want to focus in the first release, but then version 2, we want to have this and that. So is it also incremental sometimes, or?
Unfortunately, my general experience has been it's not, but it should be. And one of the things I've tried to do consistently is push that way, is push towards MVPs around NFRs. I think it's critical to do so. But no, normally I see them either not covered and then thought about later when something doesn't meet somebody's expectation, or covered in the, I expect to have I expect this to be just as fast as Google search results. I'm like, oh, okay, but there's a lot that goes on to get there. Yeah. So again, I see two spectrums, and what I think we in the engineering and the product design side need to do is try and focus on, okay, what's important and how do we build it? And that is MVP focused.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I do like that description of it. I haven't thought of it in that light. I think that's a great way of thinking about it. We would do the same on functional requirements. I chop mercilessly on functional requirements in early phases. Like, nope, don't need it. Nope, don't need it.
Perfect.
You should take the same approach on NFRs and say, nope, don't need it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think so I just want to, since you have added some of the great points here, this can be taken like thumb rules to follow. How would you summarize, so if I have to summarize, for example, the answers that you have given. So I think first you would start with, talking to people, having like a lot of interviews, talking to different types of people just to gain more context from the user's perspective as well. And focusing right from the user experience and not because some other app has it or, about this non-functional requirement, right? So if the user experience is still good enough, even if you don't consider this non-functional requirement, even if this is not met, I think it's still fine. And then you said about the future, it's best to be as short-term as we can, but still following the best practices to be able to extend the non-functional requirements if required in future, right? Did I miss anything? Would you add something to this?
No, I think that's a very effective summary of some of the points that I would try to bring up and try and emphasize. I guess the one area I would make sure we add, interviews should also include all of us. Every engineer ought to make attempts to build their network with other engineers in different domains, different spaces, different problem sets. People you don't know today, connect with them. Engineers have fascinating perspectives around NFRs because they're the ones picking up pieces. They're the ones who are trying to meet things. They're the ones who see challenges. Find out what NFRs do other people think are most important. It's actually a question that I think about frequently. It's like, all right, all these NFRs categories, what is most important? I may have very different answers than you have, than somebody else has, but that's where you begin to get perspectives that are not about a particular technology, not about a particular business problem, but about the landscape of technology. What are things to focus on that I may not be thinking about?
Yeah, that makes sense. So if I have to, so non-functional requirements are more about all the ilities or ities that we have. What are the most common ilities or ities that you have seen are very effective to start thinking from day one while we are, starting to build an application?
There is one that I would put out before any other one. I call it traceability. From the get-go, when I build something, as an engineer, I need to be able to see a user's experience in my data. That's going to be a combination of my database, but mostly it's going to be logs. As much as I wish we didn't have to rely on logs, they are absolutely invaluable for understanding user experiences and early stage for understanding user problems. Out of the gate, build in traceability. Ask yourself, if a user sees an error in the app, how will I know what they did? You want to make sure you answer that. I mean, at this point, I feel like I have a series of techniques I use. It's like, request identifiers, session identifiers, standardizing my logging methods so that those identifiers make it into each and every message, make sure that all of this is put into places so that I can now build Elasticsearch queries and get a full stack of events. Now, again, Amazon has X-ray services very similar to this. Cloud providers have common things like this as well. There's a number of different ways of implementing it, but in terms of IDIs, I always put traceability in first, because that's what's going to break when you build something. If something's going to break, I put, for example, this is a area it's an area that I've had lots of conversations with business owners. There's a trade-off: traceability versus reliability. In other ways, I phrase it as recovery versus prevention. Somebody says, well, wouldn't you rather prevent the bug? I'm like, yeah, I can't possibly prevent every bug. I cannot prevent every way a user is going to exercise my system. Focusing on reliability, functional reliability of your application stack as an NFR is a limited problem. I will always fail. Unfortunately, my applications will always fail. I can say that with 100% certainty. I believe the most relevant use of my time on an engineer is focusing on traceability so that I can recover quickly. As soon as I have something, how fast can I find the cause and fix it? I think so. That's the most important in my mind. Other ones that to me follow on from that get to testability. Now, testability, I use that as sort of a buzzword for any number of different things that get to programmatic exercise of my code. That doesn't just mean obviously unit tests and integration tests. We all do that, but it does begin to build my code to be tested. Now, this may be a bad categorization, but I actually put the programmatic management of my infrastructure, the programmatic management of my code into a bucket I tend to call testability, which is I want all this stuff to be managed via my code. I do want to be able to test my whole infrastructure deployment, test my whole deployment of this, eliminate the large category of manual errors that I have created over the course of my lifetime. I want to focus on prevention of that. So again, testability is one of the next things as an engineer we begin building into it. There's lots of other security. We talk about reliability. Performance doesn't really have an IDI, but performance IDI. Those ones come later in my mind. Again, we build with this. I'm not saying, well, yes, do I lock down a system early on? No, it's not important until I'm actually beginning to gather user data. But early on, it's like, okay, I know how I will lock down systems. Those move into known problems. I don't have to worry about that yet. I have to worry about the things I don't know how to do yet, make sure I'm positioned to address those. So that's where I tend to put my focus up first. I know a lot of people think very differently about it. A lot of security focused people who are probably listening to this are cringing when I say I would worry about security secondarily. But that's what's important for all of us. There are no right answers in this space. There are better answers for a given product, given platform that you're building. There are worse answers. It's important for all of us to be understanding of the different categories and to be able to make the judgments and thoughts ourselves about what's relevant for this problem right now.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that is very interesting. And if someone would have asked me this question, I wouldn't have come up with testability and traceability as one of the non-functional requirements on top of my list. Definitely, I would have done it, when I implemented, like as a developer. But I wouldn't necessarily call it out like a traceability and testability as non-functional requirement. But it's very interesting, and I feel that it's really important to actually also talk about this and also think about these right from the day one. So yeah, that's very interesting. I have some questions around this. So in my experience, I have been part of some of the projects where we were really building something from scratch. We didn't have any sample or existing application to look at. So we were trying a lot of new things. We were working fast to get features out, test them out, and iteratively improve our product. So in that case, yes, traceability, testability was really immensely helpful to get the features out quickly and track down errors and problems that users might face. So I think this makes a lot of sense for those kind of applications which are you're building from scratch. Mm-hmm. What about those features that I want to add to a product that already has, let's say, billions or millions of customers, right? So would that change when I'm just adding a new feature as compared to completely new product?
Very much so. Very much so. You're right. And you're right. I'm answering these questions a lot with the thought of starting at zero. Once I'm starting later on in the life cycle of a product, the questions to ask are very different.
Yeah.
Why? Number one, I have a community. That community includes business owners. It includes clients. It might include end users, different from clients, depending on your industry. I have a community of people. They have established expectations. So now what that gets to is some of the measuring sticks about NFRs have moved from the very, very vague and uncertain into a more concrete and tangible space. Second, I have more data at my fingertips.
Yeah.
Hopefully, if you've done the parts of traceability, right? But if not, you can come along and find those. You have data available. So let's talk about performance of an app. At the beginning, I don't know anything. Fortunately, my users don't know anything. So we build with very vague sense of performance expectations with the idea that we're going to start measuring it and the idea that it has to be fast. Come back to it a year. I got 1 million users. They're already used to performance. Now I have my logs, I have my measurements and say, what are my response times? This is what my user expects. I want to add a feature. It sure better be in line with user expectations. So I don't have the freedom on the engineering side to ignore that. Now I have to build to that. So yes, as you're further in a product lifecycle, you have more expectations, which is unfortunate. I never like expectations. I like softer expectations. But to offset that, I have the data that tells me what to meet. It's like, okay, you can always tell me to do more as long as you give me something. Don't tell me to make a response time in 3 seconds when none of us have any idea whether 3 seconds is reasonable. Oh, you want me to give you a half-second response time and you give me 6 months of data that say all these other calls that do comparable things, they sit in a quarter of a second response time. I'm like, oh, okay, I can meet that. I can set up tooling to measure this, to meet this, and at that point, I've eliminated a lot of the uncertainties. From our side, we ought to be able to estimate what it takes to get there. Because again, we have more knowledge. Whenever we have more knowledge, it is okay. It's appropriate for the business to ask us for more precise measurements, more precise estimates. We have more available. We should give more data.
Absolutely.
So yes, as the software matures, there's probably a focus on user-facing NFRs, if that's even a thing, become more important. A user-facing is more about what are the NFRs that govern a user experience than the NFRs that govern the development team's experience. I focus early on the NFRs that probably govern a lot of the developer experience to ensure that we're able to rapidly develop and meet customer experience. Later on, it becomes more important for the user-facing side.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yes, it depends on what stage of application development you are at. And sometimes, just to take an example, so let's say I'm doing something, I'm building an application which is completely new. No one has done it in the market, right? So that's a completely new territory. And then I think the traceability, testability, and the security, a lot of stuff can be removed, but traceability and testability will make a lot of difference. And then there is the other case that we just talked about where your product is mature enough. Let's say you're Amazon and you're just adding like a new feature. So there is like a brand attached to whatever feature you add, and you can't lack on security. You can't lack on performance, whatever. And then there is a third one. Maybe there are more, but the third one that came to my mind is you are developing something that is already solved, right? So you are not a brand, but there is a brand in like parallel to you. So there's already some expectations that people have. So for example, there's an e-commerce platform and I want to build my own e-commerce platform. So if there is a search experience that Amazon is providing, maybe not as good as Amazon, but something similar to that standard, I think I should focus on that, right? So what is your take on that?
That's a great characterization of it, because that is the one that becomes the hardest to achieve.
Yeah.
It's being held to the NFRs established by far more mature platforms and companies. Much as I love Google, they've made searching my documents really hard because of how effectively and quickly they do it. So that is a tough categorization of problems. That again is all rolls back into the assessment of the of the early stage interview process, is figuring out what is important. What do you have to meet? Which does mean, how am I going to meet the customer needs? If you ask me about things such as, again, I'm going to do a document search. Okay, there are actually, at this point, all of us as an engineer should ask, if a problem is solved, what do we know about how it's solved? What can we learn about how it's solved? What tooling should we bring? Sometimes that'll get us a long way. Oh, Google search documents. I'm like, okay, I can make an approximate of that, probably built on top of Elasticsearch. That becomes a tool I have to build, part of the design. All started with the fact that there is a expectation, the NFR, the response time, that was established by the user expectation. Sometimes the answer is, I can't figure out how somebody else has solved a really hard problem. What do I do? Yeah. Okay, again, on the engineering side, what I've traditionally pushed back is to say, let me turn a hard technology NFR into a usability NFR, which means, if I don't know how to do this and it might be hard, how can I change the functional requirements or change something in the usability to deflect a hard problem? So again, this starts with the same NFR problem that says, what's important? Our users have expectations of this kind of behavior to solve this problem. Again, sort of rolling back to what is an NFR? How do we discover it? By understanding the business. Now we're left trying to figure out how to meet this. To meet it, I can either find some tooling that I think will get there, or scratch my head and say, I don't know. Okay, when I don't know, can I revisit a user flow and say, a trivially bad example is you search for something and I know it's going to take a long time. What can I ask you to do in between that makes you think you're still advancing the problem while I'm processing the hard problem behind the scenes? How can I deflect an NFR by introducing different things? That becomes part of the game for those kinds of problems. Because yes, there's a trade-off between the cost of solving an NFR and the cost of, and the value of that NFR. Again, and my experience has been, I said before, there's this nonlinear curve of the cost. The more I have to meet something, it gets more and more and more expensive. Earlier in the development of a feature, earlier in the development of a product, I want to defer those costs as much as possible. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can't. And then you may end up failing a product because you can't meet an NFR. It won't be the first time I've done that as well. You fail products because you can't meet the expectations. But the more you can deflect that, and then put your creativity hat, take your engineer hat off, put your user hat on for a moment, and just think, how do I change the user experience to make that problem go away? Yeah. So that's the other way I kind of look at it from a usability perspective. Yeah. Usability is one of the tricky ones. It's an itty word. It sort of feels like an NFR, but it's actually kind of not. It's much closer to a functional set of requirements, which is more how do the users get the value out of it? It really is, usability to me is much closer to a functional set of requirements than a non-functional set of requirements. Yeah. Makes sense. I'm usually confused when we talk about security as a non-functional requirement. I sometimes
I'm not very sure. Is it a functional requirement? Is it a non-functional requirement? And I believe it depends on the type of application and the security issue that we are talking about. But what is your take on that? So, for example, I am sending an email. I have an email application, let's say a Gmail, right? Security is, or let's even go further. I have a banking application, right? So security is one of my top concerns. But let's say I have, I don't know, some background running application that will just club your pictures and show you, related pictures or something. Security might be, put on the back burner. So what is your take on that? Is security sometimes a functional requirement or it's more like a...
Nope. My mind, it's always a non-functional. Now,
okay.
But it's always important to realize that non-functional does not at all equate to less important, nor does non-functional prevent prioritization of them. So security, depending on your industry, could be absolutely critical. Again, fails your company if you can't meet your standards. Okay, but back to the requirement, it's still a how, not a what. I could be, a banking example. The requirement is I can deposit my money today and withdraw it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay. As insecure as the bank is, they may have so much money. It is a Elon Musk funded bank that they don't actually care about the money being siphoned off. I'm like, okay, you've met my functional requirements. Now, again, it's a bad example, but the point is the functional requirements describe what must be done. The non-functional requirements, the security to define what do we have to do to meet those requirements. And again, if I have a bank application with no guarantee of security, I also have no business. So it is a critical non-functional requirement. But if I was to think in terms of a functional requirement, I write a user story that says, do this, do this, do this. These are my expected outcomes. How do I write that about security? I personally, I don't know how to write that as a user story. And it's a sort of unfair comparison, but functional requirements are user stories. They describe what needs to be done. Security doesn't really fit that model. To me, it is a non-functional, but at that point we're really blending because what's what, but the answer is it's critical. Nothing else matters unless I've met that non-functional requirement. But that's how I think of it, because it really, part of it is I don't necessarily need the business owners involved in how am I going to do this? What guards and protections and security am I going to put around my system? Those are very technical in nature. So and again, if I view non-functional requirements as the domain, as the realm of the engineering side of it, I think that's where it fits. It's critical for the engineers to recognize that this is, in fact, an absolutely critical, business critical non-functional requirement. So that's how I think of security, and that's why I consistently put it there. And then again, it falls in the same line of, well, how much is security worth to me in this space? I'm trading around anonymous images on an account that that's all very anonymized. I'm like, well, how secure is it? I don't know. It's different than if it's even different than the social media where those images are no longer anonymous. They're associated with a person. Now they have some other meaning. They have a different level of security, let alone if those be images of your medical records with other information associated with them. How much security depends on what's necessary for your business.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Talking about so when we are approaching NFRs, we are considering some of the NFRs as important, and we do some prioritization, and we also say that, this NFR we might address, let's say 6 months down the line. And then once I reach that point, I have to look back, why did I take this decision? Because let's say there was a customer issue or something. So in that case, I think documentation of whatever decisions we are making is really, really helpful. even if, let's say, I am not anymore working on the product, someone else is, that might also help them. So in your experience, how do we document NFRs? What is a good way to do that? And maybe some format, some products that we could use, something like that.
Rather than formats and products, I think of them more in how do I write anything in a place that someone else can find it at the necessary time. If I'm putting documents somewhere else, a wiki, a company Confluence page, something like that, and it's not your company's primary means of communicating requirements, guess what? It's going to be lost to the sands of time. You will have put all of this effort in to describe something. You will have sent links and bookmarked it to everybody, and nobody will find it at the time they need it, and it will have been lost, and somebody else is going to be trying to recreate it. What you have to do, more than choosing the right tool for it, is figure out how to represent this in your current flow of engineering. I'm a very, very Jira-centric engineer. So to me, a non-functional requirement, as I build it, I'm going to write a Jira card. It's going to describe, not in the same level of details as what I'm doing for functional requirements, but it's going to describe what am I trying to achieve, why am I trying to achieve it. From there, I may reference any other third-party places where I've put it. A Google Doc I wrote, a Confluence page.
Yeah.
But now it's in my Jira, the notes about it. Now, as I'm writing code, and this gets to why I want to manage infrastructure as code, because now I make commits to reflect these changes. Those commits refer to my Jira from where you go anywhere else. And so now my code is my documentation source for this, not comments in the code. Those are irrelevant. They are usually going to be wrong by the time you see them. But I can now start using my Git history, my annotations, and start tracing changes here. What did they leave? Or in Jira, I do this all the time. I need to search for information in Jira about changes we made. So I can get to it in either of two ways. But the key is they're documented in essentially the same way you document the rest of your engineering work, rather than choosing other places to put it. Because if you put them somewhere else, as thorough and as complete as they are for you today, they will be incomplete, incorrect, or forgotten tomorrow. So you've got to keep them as part of the normal documentation workflow that your engineering team is using, whatever that is.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And that doesn't add this burden of, documenting NFRs in a separate tool or something, because you are kind of embedding that whole process in your general software development process, the way you do for functional requirements. So I think that makes it a little bit easier to maintain and also manage.
Where that approach causes problems, and this is not a problem with that approach, but where it causes problems is often these JIRAs don't lend themselves to the same sprint methodology, sprint cadence that your engineering team is following. They don't estimate nearly as well. So they may be cards that live for a while with different work. So it's almost as if, as I think aloud, there's almost a separate project, a separate flow for them so that they don't reflect in your sprint cadence. It's hard to point them. Security. It's like, how am I going to point that? It's more of an underpinning that describes everything I'm doing. But at some point, I do write code that is specifically about security stuff. That's the code, the commits that I reference those JIRAs and say, this is what I'm doing here. This is why I'm doing this. So again, you start building the traceability, but it doesn't follow the same functional development workflow. Trying to make that happen does become problematic. It just does, but it's solvable problems. For us, traditionally what I see means, these stories are never going to be completed in this sprint. They're just not. They take more time to work their way through. If you're all comfortable with that, if everybody's comfortable with that, then okay, that's great. But don't penalize a team for not doing something we never expected to be done, but needed to allocate and show on the workflow. So that's kind of why I'd suggest managing them differently, different projects, different Kanban board if you want. Now, it's not probably doesn't lend itself to a Kanban board, but it is different work than typical sprint work, but I would try to represent it in the same mechanism.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in your experience, where do you see, often where people make mistakes when it comes to NFRs? And what kind of mistakes, if you could give some examples from your experience, like NFRs gone wrong? Are there some examples like that?
I think, to me, the ones I fall back on for me as NFRs go wrong deal with measuring of performance. And they start with the idea that something has to be fast. Okay. That turns into, somebody tell me what fast is. So for example, we had one that said, the Rasa front page for our dashboard, our SaaS app, has to load in, on average less than a second. Okay. Great. Technologically, we meet that. That's pretty easy to do.
Yeah.
Because it's just, it's a JavaScript app. Wait, so I can get all the JavaScript loaded, all the CSS loaded, all of that running in a second. Nope, not a problem. But wait, all of the data on the front page, that's all coming in via AJAX calls. Those calls might be slow. Wait a minute, the failure in the NFR is in understanding what's the expectation. 1 second page load, that's what we met. It's an interesting example of a user using a technical enough term that a technology side just said, 1 second page load? Yeah, I got that. No problem. Done. Without stopping to answer, wait, what's the use case? What are we actually looking for? It's almost like, no, the easier answer is, I want the user to be able to use the page in 1 second. User couldn't use the page in a second, but it was loaded. It was then all of the necessary data. So I think that's probably the most common occurrence I see of failures is around the articulation of a requirement on performance. And a number of times, the more I've failed at that NFR, the more I've realized how hard that is as an NFR to articulate. What does it mean for a page to be loaded? It's like, that's the easy thing I have 7 different AJAX widgets sitting on the page. One of them may fail to load. One of them may be slow because of the volume of data. 6 of them are working. What's my response time? So in the end, that's a long way of getting to what I see as probably the most common type of failure. It just gets to assessing expectations, usually around performance, but not only around performance. Mm-hmm. And even the language, it's like, if somebody says something that feels business enough, the business people think they're talking the right language. Business person says something technical enough that the technical people think they're saying the same thing, and realize, no, there's the communication gap because we don't mean the same thing, and we're sort of incorrectly using verbs and nouns from somebody else's vocabulary. That's a common communication. There's nothing about that miscommunication specific to NFRs, just sort of a way that I've seen it happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think I've also seen it, something very vague or not clearly defined can lead to misunderstanding. And that's, I think, not only the case with non-functional requirement, but anything product managers and developers do together, right? Because there's a lot of communication gaps. And
that's why when I come back to my example of this early stage company, my performance measurement is fast enough. Okay, I've bolded it. I've said it's fast enough. And the reason being is I want to emphasize in hopefully common language to everybody, the uncertainty in this space. Don't put a number to represent something that we all don't know. Yeah. Let's identify the NFR, identify that it's important, and clearly identify that we don't know. So that's going to put all of our focus on early stage. Let's assess response time. That gets to data acquiring, making sure we have all the data. It guides us through a lot of the implementation. And the statement of work early has to acknowledge and emphasize the uncertainty with it. So trying to get as clear as we can. Nobody thinks we're meeting something we don't know yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing, and I know I'm going back a little bit, but you mentioned that, traceability is one of the most important ones. So I understand, from developer standpoint, having good logs, all levels, and also a little bit more verbose logs, so you could see what's exactly happening right at the beginning, really helps. Where does observability comes into picture? Because observability also has some cost attached to it, right? So I might not want to do it right from day one, but as something as cheap as logs, I think it's fine to have something like that. But having good observable system might also have some cost attached to it. So do you mean by, yeah.
I was going to say, help me understand what you mean by observable system in that context.
Yeah, so having a different set of metrics and toolings around it, having Grafana, also searchable logs and all those kind of things, which might, let's say I'm at a startup, I don't have good Grafana cluster or something. I don't have access to all those systems, right? So as a developer, I cannot ask for it. I can only say, okay, I'll have good logs because I want to have some traceability. I'll have some metrics in some way, but I can't have more than that. I can't have, let's say, distributed tracing using open tracing or something. So that makes it a little bit of challenge. But do you think logs are a good starting point? What else can we do?
No. Yes. No, I personally think logs are not only the right starting point, they can be sufficient. Yeah. I'm able to, with the right logging systems, which early on in my career, yes, we spent more money on embedding logging systems. Now, with a lot of cloud providers, logging is nothing more than a print statement. And now, for example, in Amazon, that all routes through CloudWatch, which is all easily text string searchable with metrics that can be built upon it. So for me, when I'm building ground up, I'm like, nope, print statement is my friend. Print statements I can now tie to that. And, as I said earlier, it's important to try and standardize. So no, I don't actually litter print statements. I litter wrappers around print statements to make sure I can get my tokens, my formatting consistent across this. That is sufficient for me. I think that is, yes, that can be quite sufficient, especially with the tooling that is now available in most cloud providers to be able to analyze well-structured log statements. I don't need much more than that. Amazon offers X-ray services, which allow you to get more information end-to-end through that. I've never felt the need to turn it on. CloudWatch Logs has always been my go-to source for metrics, for usage, for understanding.
Okay, that makes sense. In my experience, I've seen a couple of times when non-functional requirements actually drive what functional requirements can we support. And sometimes we had to, remove the functional requirements that, we cannot do it because it's really costly because of the non-functional requirements, which is the performance and cost and, the other things. In your experience, have you seen it happening more often where you see that, we add it as a functional requirement because it sounds cool, it sounds okay, maybe it's possible, but then somewhere down the line, we figured this is not going to work. Just to give an example, we exposed an API to get a list of records, and these records were generated using IoT applications. So these were really huge number of records, and getting them in a sorted order I think that was the requirement. But then somewhere down the line, it became really challenging because we couldn't sort more number of records
Right.
after a certain time range. And it was really getting like either you increase the page load times, or you just time out, or you don't provide all the records. So there is some trade-off that we had to make. And then we eventually just said, okay, let's not support sorting, but more than a given time frame. So what are your experience with this?
Yeah, no, there's always a pushback, a back and forth between functional requirements and non-functional requirements.
Yeah.
What's critical is when, us as engineers have to put on our business hats for a moment and understand what's the business value. What is the proposition that makes customers want to give us their hard-earned dollars? Back to the example of sorting. It's like, oh, okay, is that a convenience? No, or is that actually fundamental to our value prop? It becomes fundamental to the value prop in some sense if the actual ordering of events is critical to our customers understanding the data. Yeah. If that's the case, then yes, my functional requirements have to take precedence, and my technology has to work out ways to meet that. Perhaps with limitations, as you described, perhaps with other ways around it. But if it's not part of the value prop of the business, it doesn't matter whether these things are sorted or not, because you can learn what you want either way. Well, then the technology can very well take precedence. So it asks the engineering side to really stop and try and understand the business model. I can just as easily say, and some of my best and most enjoyable experiences are when I can work with product managers who I can say, put on the engineering side. And they try. There's in some sense, a difference in depth of knowledge or specificity of knowledge. It's harder, perhaps, for a product manager to understand sort algorithms and why they're hard and why document management systems. That's a hard bridge to cross. And I don't mean this as a way of belittling the work and expertise that the product managers do, but I find it's a little bit easier for a technologist to be able to at least stop and understand, why is this important to a customer? Product management work gets hard in trying to figure out what do we do for customers? What is it? They articulate that problem to us, and now we have to understand that problem. Why is this important? And blend the technology. So again, I don't mean this in a way of sort of belittling the work of product managers. They do very, very important things. I find it's a little easier for engineers to be able to grasp the product side than the product side to be able to grasp some of the intricacies that get in the way, especially of non-functional requirements.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense. Before we end this episode, I want to ask you if, for our viewers and who are watching this episode, if they have to take away 3 things from whatever we discussed, right, just to get better at NFRs, what would be those 3 things that you would say, don't miss on this?
Let's see. 3 things. Number 1, I look through my notes. Let's call it, start again. All right, 3 things as I go through my notes. Number 1, interviews. Okay, that's a broad term, but it's a challenge to all of us to expand our knowledge. Get that by talking to business people. Get it by talking to other technology people. Get it by reading and following more podcasts. Understand non-functional requirement problems other people have met, how they've solved them. Build your tool set definitions. Number 2, cost-benefit trade-offs. Understand and learn how to articulate the trade-off in exceeding non-functional requirements. None of us know the shape of the curve, but it costs a lot more to get one more 9 on a uptime than it did to get the last 9.
Yeah.
Understand that and be able to articulate it. Number 3, that goes with that, especially for the engineers, be ready to put on your business hat ask yourselves, when do I have to do the work I might not want to do because the business problem demands it? That extra 9 is going to cost a lot. It's going to be hard, but I recognize the importance of it and be ready and willing to do it. And I guess the other half of the business hat is recognizing, no, wait, that extra 9 isn't important. Don't do the work because I don't need to. Do the right work at the right time.
Yeah, perfect. Wonderful.
Number four, you asked for 3, but 4, I'm going to throw my buzzword out there. Traceability. Make sure you instrument that in any given system. Number of times I've wished I had that later. So.
Yeah, makes sense. That's a bonus for our viewers, but yeah. Great. Well, Paul, I can't thank you enough for, sharing your experience, and all the, insights into non-functional requirements, because it's such an important topic, and it's so vast, and there's a lot of confusion that I feel that, listening to this podcast, people would get a better sense of non-functional requirements, and they'll have like a different view point towards how to define NFRs, how to document them, how to approach them. And I'm pretty sure that they are going to get a lot of insights, and it will add a lot of value to their daily work life whenever they are building software applications. So thanks a lot. I also hope that you also liked this discussion, and we can go on and on, but unfortunately we have to end this episode here. And I look forward to collaborate with you more on some of the other interesting topics. So, but yeah, thanks a lot.
Well, thank you. And thank you for putting together the GeekNarrator podcast. I've enjoyed listening to the episodes, and please feel free to, for any of your other listeners, if they want to connect with me, please, I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there, or help, reach out and get me connected.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also going to attach some of the resources that you have shared with me, so it can help people. And for the viewers, if you like this episode, if you like this discussion, please don't forget to hit the like button. And also, please subscribe to the channel, because it helps me understand how am I doing and what I need to do more. So thanks a lot, and see you next time.